So last fall, I missed out on attending a discussion that I really wanted to attend on this book, Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, which covers his moral foundations theory. And the meeting I attend, the Quaker meeting, Live Oak Friends meeting, was having a discussion of this book that I really would have liked to attend. And a big part of the reason I wanted to attend that meeting was because it would have brought me full circle. Because one of the reasons I started attending Quaker meeting in the first place came after reading this book, and I'll get into that. But it was at exactly the same time that I was presenting at Houston Nerd Nights on the connection between humans and Kias, and I had committed to that before I knew that this would be a thing. And this is the presentation, as I said, I'm going to eventually do a recorded version and upload it to this channel. So I missed out on that, but I really wanted to go to it because it sort of took me full circle in a way. So then I went and I wrote a script. I was still doing basically scripted video essays, and I read it, and it took me over 20 minutes to read. And I'm like, since it takes about 3.5 to 4 times as long with all the missteps and re-recordings, I'd be there for like an hour and a half, which I just could not see how to do. And now that I'm speaking off the cuff, I don't need to get everything that I covered in that script. I will put the script up. By the time you see this, it will be on my Substack, and I will put the link in the description. But I'm just going to explain the idea of the moral foundations theory, the issues I had with it, the issues I still have, why I think it is still relevant regardless, and also how that led to me starting to attend Quaker meeting. And it is suitable that for this discussion, I have Leela, who is a Quaker parrot. Want to say hi, Leela? No, she's not usually that talkative. So the moral foundations theory says that there are 6 dimensions that humans can use in terms of making moral judgments, and conservatives and traditional societies use all 6 of them. Liberals use 3, and libertarians use only 1. And so everybody agrees on the autonomy or liberty moral dimension. Liberals also recognize a fairness and a care-harm dimension, with usually care-harm having the highest priority. Conservatives and traditional societies who recognize all 6 equally also recognize authority, loyalty, and sanctity. And so I initially had 3 issues with the moral foundations theory as expressed by Haidt in this book. One of those issues I think I was wrong about. One of them I think I wasn't wrong about, but I wasn't quite getting the bigger picture. And then I'll have a new issue that I've identified since then. So the 3 issues I identified at the time. First of all, so I come from a more culturally left background. I've identified as libertarian since I was 17. And I adhered to all of the liberal dimensions, and I also was aware I adhered to a version of the sanctity and loyalty dimensions, although not the authority dimension. And the authority dimension has been for a long time the one that has been hardest for me to understand. But I also noticed that a lot of people on the left do have these 3 dimensions, loyalty, sanctity, and purity. They just don't apply the way that Haidt describes them as applying to conservatives and traditional societies. And so, I mean, you hear the purity testing idea, but I also have had a tendency to avoid books that I would see as tainted. And I've realized on the more cultural left, there is this fear of being tainted by ideas that come from unclean sources. There's also very much a tendency to appeal to authorities. We saw this whole trust the science with COVID, and also trust the experts with the economy's fine under Biden. And then loyalty is more complicated, but I think you see patterns of that on the left too. They just don't look like Haidt did. And I also thought you had subpopulations that differed, because I'm like, okay, well, I'm maybe sort of between liberal and libertarian, and that reflects my ranking of liberty tended to come first, then care-harm, and then fairness came third. But I was like, okay, things seem more complicated than just these 3, although it's interesting because, so this book, Arnold Kling, which I will talk about, I'm going to make a shorter video on this concept too, and I'll talk about Kling more, also identifies 3 distinct languages. And reading this book, I realized I don't really rely on either the libertarian or the liberal language in making my arguments, and I didn't even really believe him initially about liberals arguing based on what he calls the oppression dynamic, until after reading this book, and I'm like, oh, he does. And libertarians basing arguments on liberty I obviously got, but I didn't get the implications. And then he says conservatives tend to base arguments on a contrast between civilization versus barbarism. So I'll talk more about this book. But anyways, I was like, okay, I think there might be subpopulations that aren't reliable, although this is just one of those things where I'm just so weird for everything. And one thing to keep in mind is I come from a rural area. And so rural areas tend to be more politically conservative in developed societies. And I come from one of the few rural areas that has still been mostly democratic, but you still have, I think, more of an appreciation of the values of sanctity and loyalty in the more conventional sense than I think people in urban areas get. So I was questioning how accurate, like, it seems like this could be more complicated, there could be more subgroups. And I was also questioning, do liberals really not have these other three dimensions, or are they just used differently? And then the other thing is this whole idea of traditional societies. What Haidt describes as traditional societies aren't that traditional. They are all agricultural societies in states. And I've read a lot of books on hunter-gatherers and small-scale agriculturalists. In fact, you can see behind me Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes by Daniel Everett, who I actually got to meet in person. And I got him to sign a copy for a friend of mine, although this copy I got later, which is a memoir of his life among the Piraha, who are hunter-gatherers in the Amazon, and have a value system that sounds a lot more like what Haidt would describe as the libertarian one. And the value system that James Sussman describes of the San people sounds much more similar to how Haidt would describe liberals, where there's a much more of a priority on fairness. Fairness and liberty are sort of the two main dimensions that the San seem to follow according to how Sussman describes it. And so when you have these traditional societies, but they're all state-based agriculturalists, state-based grain agriculturalists, I don't know how much that really tells you. And I still think these two issues are valid. And then the third issue that I raised, I no longer think is valid, which is I was like, I feel like there's also a missing honesty, like hypocrisy one. And I realized I think that really just reduces to the other dimensions. And I was convinced of it because, well, mainly because like the Hexaco personality inventory pulls it out, but also it was reinforced because I started attending Quaker meeting, and the testimony of integrity is one of the Quaker testimonies. And we also have the testimony of equality and the testimony of peace, which could be understood as a care-harm thing. And so it's like, it seemed sort of distinct, and I'm realizing, no, I can still see how it fits into those axes now, but I believed it was an issue at the time. On the other hand, I now have a new issue with this book, which is actually kind of a surprising one, which is his methodology, because he is doing experimental psychology in the way that I was taught to do it in undergrad. But I've come to the conclusion, so you can see behind me, Arthur Koestler, Ghost in the Machine, this green book. I pulled it out before, I'm not pulling it out here. He talks about the whole issue of extreme reductionism in science and how that doesn't work because you're missing emergent properties of how things combine. And the way that Haidt did this is less reductionist than a lot of experimental psychology, but it's still reliant on a reductionist experimental psychology approach. And I'm not going to go into that in more detail here, but I think that means you're missing a lot of nuance. On the other hand, I also objected to Haidt saying, okay, well, there's still value in these conservative dimensions as they are presented. And I was like, well, I see some value in some aspects of the loyalty and sanctity dimensions, which again could be coming from a rural area, but I don't get the authority dimension at all. That doesn't seem to have value at all. And I think that's because, as Nassim Nicholas Taleb would say, our current authorities don't have skin in the game. And so I've grown up with authorities they don't face the consequences of what they do in terms of affecting the rest of us. But I think if you had traditional authorities who had skin in the game, who had a stake in the consequence of their actions, maybe that would make more sense. And reading Chesterton, I'm like, okay, I can sort of see that. And then I'm also realizing, okay, traditions, like in the sense of Chesterton's fence, that kind of makes sense too. And so anyways, so I'm like, okay, yeah. So Haidt, I think, is still describing something here, even if I don't agree on all the details, and it's a good starting point. And I think he is right that there is value in, even the conservative conception of at least loyalty and sanctity, not to the degree that I often see conservatives articulate it. But and it's funny, because Chesterton identified as a liberal, but made one of the best defenses of at least the sanctity dimension, I think the loyalty dimension too, actually. And again, the authority dimension was the one that I still really struggled with, and I think it's because I'm just not used to seeing authorities that have skin in the game, And so I'm used to authorities just behaving irresponsibly, giving bad advice, which I might get into in a future video. So this book, why did I go to Quaker meeting after reading it? Well, it did highlight that my values, my understanding of my values, was different than a lot of the liberals I was interacting with. And I was really frustrated by the whole, oh, Trump supporters are like evil, what is wrong with them discourse. Because my attitude is always, except for the maybe 2% of the population who are sociopaths possibly, everybody wants to do well, wants to do good according to our own values, but we don't always agree on what our values are. And then we don't have the energy, the information, the time to actually figure out what is the best way to live them. And so we need to give other people grace for not doing how we want. And I was frustrated because I wanted, okay, well, I don't want to go hang out with actual Trump supporters because I don't share their end values. But I'm also frustrated hanging out with people on the left who don't share my sort of process values about trying to understand people, about giving them grace. And it occurred to me, oh, Quakers I've met tend to be good about this. I should go to Quaker meetings. So I started doing that, and eventually I came to believe in Quakerism. And so that is why I really wanted to attend that discussion on the righteous mind that unfortunately I couldn't. But then I did write that script that I will post on my Substack. And I think also this is a good book and idea to know about because it's influenced a lot of people, and you'll see a lot of people citing Haidt, and a lot of them cite him uncritically. And I might talk more about these issues. As I said, 2 of my issues I think still apply. The subpopulations, and I think that most people have them, but with liberals they don't look the way he described. The whole tradition isn't really as traditional as he claimed. And then my new point about this is still experimental psychology, and it's still done in a very reductionist fashion that I think misses a lot of nuance and complexity as opposed to how someone like Chesterton addresses this issue. But I still think it's a good book to understand. It's worth reading if you're interested in this subject. And I'm probably going to do, as I said, a shorter concept introduction video to this at some point. But I wanted to describe this quickly, and if you want to read the script that I never recorded for this video, that's in the link below. Anyways, I am Magpie. This is Leela, as I said. She is a Quaker parrot, and I'm a Quaker. Thank you for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.